Hey guys, I'm Chef Nick. Welcome to Building the Basics here at the Bodacious Shops. Today we're going to do some beef tenderloin, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to trim a whole beef tenderloin. You can purchase this at the store, and the advantage of getting a whole beef tenderloin rather than a filet mignon steak is that it is less expensive. So you do have to butcher it yourself, and we're going to go through the pieces that come out of an entire whole beef tenderloin and then what you can do with that. So with a whole beef tenderloin, you have multiple sides that have to be trimmed, but we're going to start here on the top with our hands, because you can get a lot of this done just by using your fingers to remove some of the skin and fat and release some of the muscle as well. So as we trim this out, we're going to use our fingers first, and what that does is it opens up this muscle that's right here. This part of the beef tenderloin is called the chain, and we're going to want to remove that. And you just kind of slowly go through with your knife, carefully removing it, because we don't want to remove any of the rest of the tenderloin. Now this piece we'll put to the side, because there's actually a lot of great meat on this. You just have to trim it a little bit more than the rest of the tenderloin to acquire it. So the other part that we want to pull off this beef tenderloin is what's called the silver skin. This is the skin that's on the top. It's tough and chewy, so we don't want it. So what you want to do is just pierce it with your knife, and I'm using a smaller knife here than I would typically use, and I'm just going to hold one end and pull it through. And the idea here is that we don't allow too much of the meat to come off onto the skin, and that'll be discarded. We're going to continue to remove the silver skin, and then we have this piece here that also contains silver skin that we want to remove. There's a separate muscle. I'll flip it over here so you can see it well. There's a separate muscle right here. We're going to pull that muscle off. Again, kind of using the tip of the knife to remove it. And then we're going to flip it over and continue to remove some of the fat. Now we don't want to remove all the fat, because the fat actually adds a lot of flavor to the meat. All right, so that's looking pretty good on that side. Remove a couple of these pieces here. All right, there we go. So this is our beef tenderloin. Now from here, there's lots of choices. You can actually take the whole beef tenderloin and roast it in the oven. Maybe do a horseradish crust or a mustard crust on there, roast it whole, and then just slice it for your guests or your family. If you do that, we have what's called the tail on this end. As you can tell, it's kind of a thinner piece, and you can actually kind of butterfly the end of that and fold it underneath when you roast it, so that you have kind of even pieces all the way through the tenderloin. But for this purpose, we're going to remove the tail, and I got a little more silver skin right here that I want to take off. And then here on the end, you can cut these into like smaller medallions for the rest of the tail. And the smaller medallions make great appetizers, or if you put 2 or 3 of them together, it makes for a really nice entree. But then also, when you get into what's called the barrel or the Chateaubriand of the beef, that's where you get your nice fillets. But you can also cut the steaks into, this is going to be about an 8-ounce piece right here. So that we have our steaks. And then if you'd like, you can also cut off this center piece. That's going to give you your Chateaubriand. You could also do that as a whole roast. You can still get more steaks on the end. And then when it gets into a smaller portion here, we go right back into our medallions. So out of this tenderloin, we have about 5 medallions. the piece that we initially cut off, I can trim that. And we can also cut this into medallions. And then these small pieces that are left over, they work really well to do like a stir fry, or if you want to cut it into pieces, you can make it into a beef stew or a stroganoff. But doing a quick stir fry with this is really nice. We can also cut this small piece here into the stir fry or stroganoff pieces. And then if you choose not to use the barrel or the Chateaubriand as a whole piece, you can obviously cut that into steaks as well. So there are our 6 filet mignons, some beef to make our stew or stroganoff, some medallions, and we have our chain left over. The chain needs to be trimmed a little bit more. So there's some silver skin on here, and what you want to do is kind of put that towards the bottom of the board, and if you hold on to it and just run your knife through, it'll take a lot of that off. So we're going to throw away that. We're going to turn it over and kind of do the same thing on this side. And these pieces that come off can also be made for your stroganoff or your stew. There we go. So what we have as far as scrap goes, we have this and this. So out of the whole beef tenderloin, this is all that we're going to throw away. This is just our trimming. And what you have left are all these various pieces to be able to make your stew, your fillets, and everything else with. A little bit of fat in your stew is a good thing, it's just going to add flavor. So that's it. So that is trimming a whole beef tenderloin, and then when we come back here, we're going to go ahead and season these up and go ahead and sear them off. All right, so we have our filet mignons here. We have 6 total. And what I'm gonna do is season this with some salt and pepper. And we're gonna do that fairly liberally on both sides. First our salt, then some pepper. I'm gonna give it a flip. And I like to use kosher salt primarily because I can see exactly how much salt I'm putting on it. You know, if you use iodized salt, oftentimes you can't tell the amount that you're using. But with kosher salt, it gives you an opportunity to see exactly how much you're putting on whatever you're seasoning. So I'm gonna kind of pat those in a little bit. And then I also have some steak seasoning. A variety of choices with steak seasoning. I would just recommend using anything that you think tastes well. There's a number of name brands out there that people use. We also sell a house steak seasoning here at Bodacious that I'm using today. But there's multiple brands out there that are really good. Now, I want to make sure that's all patted in very well. I love the flavor of rosemary. I do not like rosemary branches because it tastes like a Christmas tree in your mouth. But the rosemary oil that we have here, the rosemary olive oil, works really well. has a great flavor that you can add to a number of proteins and even vegetables. So I'm going to drizzle that and rub it in. Now I like to add the olive oil after I season, because if I add the olive oil first, I feel like it makes the beef kind of slippery and the seasoning doesn't stick on there as well. So I'm going to drizzle these with the rosemary olive oil and rub them in. Now one thing I think that's important is that once you season and rub your steaks, is that we leave them out for a little while, just to kind of bring it up to room temperature, because number one, the seasoning is going to get into the meat a little bit and add a little bit more flavor. But also when we sear this, we don't want it to be too cold to where when we add it to the pan, it reduces the temperature of the pan. We want a nice sear on the outside. So we're going to let these rest for a little while before we sear it, and then we'll go ahead and sear in some butter olive oil. So while our steaks are kind of getting to room temperature, I'm going to go ahead and do a couple sides. These are just red skin potatoes that have been boiled. I'm just going to cut those into some chunks, because we're going to do a pan roasted potato to go with our beef tenderloin. And just cook these till they're tender. And I'm going to take a little butter olive oil, and we're going to put that into a cast iron skillet. And we're going to add our potatoes to that. And I'm going to follow that up with seasoning with a little salt and pepper. We'll let those cook away. And then our vegetable that we're going to do, I found these beautiful carrots. So in this pan over here, I'm going to go again with the butter olive oil. And this one's going to be a little bit different because these are espresso glazed carrots. For some reason, espresso and carrots just go wonderfully together. So we're going to give those a toss and let those roast there as well. I'm going to hit it with a little bit of salt and a little bit of pepper. And then we're going to finish that off with the espresso balsamic. So with our fillets that we're cooking, I wanted to do some caramelized onions. So I'm just gonna go ahead and julienne up an onion. And we're actually gonna top our fillet today with gorgonzola cheese. So I wanted to have the caramelized onions and the gorgonzola together. And there's nothing wrong with maybe adding a little bit of onion to our potato. Add a little bit of flavor to those as well. All right, so one thing that's super important when we're searing any sort of protein is that we want to make sure that our pan is really hot. I'm using cast iron today. It's one of my favorite things to cook a steak on. And there's a couple different ways to tell. Obviously when the oil is smoking, it's hot, but also if you see little waves in the oil, that also signifies that the oil is at the proper temperature. So one of the mistakes that we make, you always want to hear that sizzle, that's important. But one of the mistakes that we also make is, one, we put a protein into a pan that's cold, and that brings the temperature of the pan down too quickly. But the other thing that we do is we will sometimes overcrowd the pan with the food. So you want to make sure that you're not overcrowding the pan and you're just cooking enough to kind of keep the pan hot. We can always go back and cook those other 3 steaks. We're going to give the carrots a toss, give our potatoes a toss. All right, so as we're searing this, we're gonna sear for a few minutes on each side, or at least a couple minutes, and you can check it, but the thing you don't wanna do is continue to flip your steaks over and over and over, because every time you flip it over, you're taking a cooler side and putting it onto the hot side, and you're never gonna get the sear that you're looking for doing it that way. So what you can do though is peek. So I'm just gonna pull up a corner, look underneath, and see where we're at. And we're doing pretty well. So remember, these are drizzled with rosemary olive oil to give it a little flavor, but I like cooking them in the butter olive oil just because I love butter on a steak. And of course, using the Bodacious butter olive oil, you're taking a lot of the negative health things that have to do with butter, and we're incorporating a healthier option with the olive oil. All right, so we're gonna let that go for another minute or so on that side, but I'm also gonna go ahead and add our onions now. They're just gonna caramelize in the pan with the steaks. One of the things I like about cast iron as well is that the cast iron can be used on the cooktop, but then we can also finish these steaks in the oven and can go directly into an oven. And then you can also serve out of the same cast iron, and that way you don't have to wash as many dishes, which is something I hate to do. So I think we're about where we need to be on the sear. There's a nice sear on the outside of that fillet. We have our caramelization going on. And what that's doing is searing all of the flavor and juices inside of the steak. All right, so we've got a sear on one side. We have our onions in the pan. And what I'm going to do is put this directly in the oven. Before I do, I'm going to top this with some gorgonzola cheese. I love gorgonzola cheese on a steak. If we blacken this beef, it would be considered a black and blue steak. But it's going to be really good with the gorgonzola and the caramelized onions. All right, so I'm dropping this into a 375-degree oven, and it should take about 5 to 6 minutes for that to come out medium rare. All right, and in about 5 or 6 minutes, our carrots will be done and our potatoes, and then we'll go ahead and plate that. All right, guys, to finish our carrots, what we're gonna do is we're gonna add a little bit of brown sugar just to sweeten it up. And then a bit of our espresso balsamic vinaigrette. We're gonna let that kind of glaze the carrots. We'll give it a toss. And we'll be able to turn the heat off on that. Our potatoes over here are looking quite good. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn the heat on that off. And it's been about 6 minutes, so we're gonna go ahead and pull our fillets out. There we go. So to plate this, we're gonna take our potatoes, maybe put it in the middle of the plate. Take one of these beautiful fillets, lay it on top. Take some of these caramelized onions, put it on top of that. And then a few of our espresso glazed carrots on the side. And we will clean the plate a little bit. All right, so right there is our filet mignon with the gorgonzola, caramelized onions, and the espresso glazed carrots. So I want to thank you all for joining us again on Building the Basics here at the Bodacious Shops. I'm Chef Nick. We'll see you next time. Thank you.